What I think is important to do before we dive into the philosophical thinkers that we're going to be exploring in this series is just to get a better understanding of what existentialism actually is. So we attempted to do this in the first lesson, in the introductory lesson, by asking a few questions, looking at some general ideas and principles. But this lesson is going to be focused entirely on this question, the question of what actually is existentialism, or the philosophy of existentialism more broadly. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to dive and just look at this actual single question: what actually is existentialism? And the first thing that we should really be able to do is make it very clear that it may be better to describe what existentialism isn't rather than what existentialism is. Because existentialism isn't something that we can define very, very specifically. It's not like epistemology, where we know what that is. We know that that is just the philosophy of knowledge and the questions that relate to knowledge and justification of belief. It's not like the philosophy of aesthetics, for example, on things relating to how things look, things like beauty and art. It's not like the philosophy of ethics concerning issues relating to morality, what is good and what is bad. It is something that is a much deeper than that. There's much more to it. Because, firstly, we can take the understanding of existentialism as something of a movement rather than a coherent doctrinal set of beliefs, or something of a movement rather than a school of thought. So it's not like Stoicism or another kind of idea relating to different schools of thought. It's more like a movement of ideas that exist across multiple, not just different philosophers, but also multiple different disciplines. We made a note of in the last lesson the fact that you can see existentialist thinking in the writings of Dostoevsky. Equally, existentialism isn't necessarily an atheistic movement. One idea that some people tend to promote is the idea that existentialism is inherently linked to the idea of atheism, of a lack of a belief in a god. This is not necessarily true, because as evidence that we will see in the next few lessons, the work of Søren Kierkegaard is incredibly religious. In fact, central to a lot of the philosophical and existential beliefs that Kierkegaard had is this belief in Christianity. So we don't just think about existentialism as being coherent and conjuncting with this idea of atheism. Nor is existentialism necessarily a pejorative or a negative set of philosophical beliefs. We noted in the last lesson that you could probably describe existentialism as trying to derive meaning in a world that is meaningless, or essentially accepting a view of the universe as being meaningless. This might instill in it a certain pejorative mindset and a certain negative understanding of existentialism. This isn't necessarily true either. Existentialism can be relatively positive, and it can be relatively invigorating in terms of the ideas that it presents. So you don't necessarily have to look at existentialism as a miserable or gloomy set of philosophical beliefs. And because existentialism is a movement rather than a school of thought, it means that the works we're studying aren't necessarily interlinked. It's not necessarily the case that, unlike schools of thought within, for example, the ancient Greek tradition, that one philosopher was taught and was informed and influenced by another. You can almost talk about each of these different philosophers separately, and that's what we're going to do, essentially. We're going to talk about their beliefs in isolation from each other, which is something of a nice irony given the fact that existentialism is inherently individualistic. While we're going to be looking at existentialism through the lens of a finite number of philosophers, and we're going to begin with arguably the earliest of the existentialists, that being Søren Kierkegaard, it is not beyond the realms of possibility that you can trace existentialist ideas, at least the essence of existentialism, as far back as various ancient Greek philosophers. So, for example, philosophers such as Socrates and even Heraclitus to an extent. So you could, if we wanted to, trace some traces of existentialism back as far as ancient Greek philosophy. And so this is one thing that we could do, but we're not going to, because, of course, existentialism as a broader theme, as a broader movement, didn't really kick off until the works of people like Søren Kierkegaard. But that is not to suggest that we can't see little instances of existentialism in earlier philosophies. And all this can be is just a representation that it is in no way a new philosophy per se. It is something that has existed as far back as ancient Greek philosophy, but it has only been as prominent in these earlier thinkers, such as those of Kierkegaard and people like Nietzsche and Camus and Heidegger. So, given the fact that existentialism is a movement, and again, not a specific school of thought, and given the fact that we know it is quite difficult to define existentialism, let's think about existentialism through the lens of a series of basic themes that are going to be consistent across each of these different thinkers. So, the major themes in existentialist thinking are as follows. There are three major themes. The first is there is a strong emphasis placed on the concept of individuality and individualism. We will note this very much is the case in the work of Kierkegaard over the next few lessons, in a few lessons' time. And we note that one of the reasons why Kierkegaard has this view is because he is acting and reacting to the works of collectivists such as Hegel. And we will see the distinction and delineation between Hegel and Kierkegaard over the next few lessons. There's also less of an emphasis on the traditional forms of philosophical inquiry. There is a less of an emphasis placed on that of rationality and argumentation from logic. Rather, we place an emphasis on emotion and passion. So, this is potentially one of the reasons why we might suggest that there is a stronger interplay and a stronger relationship between existentialism and various forms of literary critique and literature in general. The idea of Dostoevsky being an existentialist is not inherently the case because of its adherence to rationality and argumentation. Potentially, Dostoevsky wouldn't have been an existentialist if existentialism was rational and logical. Rather, it is this interplay with the concept and the emphasis placed on emotion and passion that maybe gives Dostoevsky a certain degree of existentialist idea. And then finally, there is also a strong position that is taken by existentialists on the nature of free will and determinism. So, according to the existentialist, the human being and the human nature will have free will and therefore is responsible for their own actions. Now, this might contrast slightly with traditional understandings of free will and rationality. So, for example, the more deliberate position on free will is taken by all of the existentialists, some more than others. So, for example, the concept of free will is very, very strong in the writings of Kierkegaard and is not as prominent in, say, the writings of Nietzsche or Heidegger. This is not to suggest that the latter of the two, i.e. Nietzsche and Heidegger, do not understand existentialism as being important, or at least free will as being important to their beliefs, just that it is not as prominently situated as front and center as that of Kierkegaard, for example. Now, before we finish, let's think about this idea of free will and rationality, because the traditional understanding that exists within philosophical movements is the idea that to act with free will is to act rationally, and to act without free will is to be a slave to one's passions, to one's emotions, and to one's desires. This is similar to that of the sort of Kantian understanding of free will and rationality and rational thought. So, how does an existentialist understand this particular dichotomy? Because essentially an existentialist takes the complete opposite opinion. They take the view that humans are having possessed free will, but that rationality is not important, that what is important is emotion, passion, and desire. Well, an existentialist will take the alternative viewpoint, the idea that one's passionate commitment may be central to the concept of them being really free. Alternatively, the alternative essentially to this idea of one being a slave to the passions and emotions and desires of humanity. So that is something that we need to just keep in mind when we carry on doing these lessons, the idea that existentialism situates itself almost as a contradiction to what other philosophical circles might view as being a precondition for the idea of free will existing within humanity. And this is this idea of rationality as opposed to emotions and passions. And we'll get to this delineation as we start to unpack the work and the life of Kierkegaard in more detail.